Welcome back, brothers and sisters. It is I, Landon Father Doom Gus, your preacher of all things homebrew and your basement dwelling nerd, here today with a video to give a bit of a cautionary tale and share a little bit of advice. And it's all going to be good. It's a fun story, but I want to tell you about how I almost TPK'd my group of 3 fairly new players in a campaign we just started last Tuesday in the very first combat. An experience that I'm sure many of you have encountered on your own, especially if you ran the Lost Mines of Findelver with that starting goblin ambush. I'm sure you've lost some groups to that or almost did. But I want to tell you how I handled it, because I think that's the value I can give you in this video. Not just, hi, whoa, that was close, almost killed my own group, but like more of like, here's how I handled it in the moment. So let's jump into that. Well, first, don't forget the Doom Stronghold Kickstarter is live. As of time of recording, with a quick refresh, we are at $1,970 raised, so we are $30 shy of that 2K stretch mark goal, so we're just going to keep climbing. There's still like 3 weeks left in the project, so go check that out. I'll have a link to the description. But anyways, let's get back to this TPK and let us pray. So, to set the stage, I'm going to put an image up of the map so you can kind of have some bearings here, but I had a group of 3 characters. There's the fighter, there was a bard, and a rogue. You'll notice, no cleric, no paladin. The bard was the only one who was really able to do any healing, and by healing, it was like healing word. But the 3 of them had arrived in this dungeon and had kind of been called there by the church. They'd kind of come out of this stupor, this sort of trance-like state, where they'd all entered into this room. The door had sealed behind them, and really the only way forward was up the stairs. And when they followed that, they arrived in this crypt with 6 sarcophagi. And I described the sarcophagi as having these tall, spire-like pyramids on the top of them with these eyes that were closed. It looks like the lids had been closed shut. And at the far side of the room, there was the door to the next chamber, flanked by these idols of these eyes that had these rings kind of orbiting them. The eyes were open, staring into the room, and the rings had prayers or something etched onto them. They weren't quite sure what they were just from a quick glance. So, of course, there was a little bit of investigation. Someone did attempt to kind of decipher, like, what are these runes? What do they say? And they failed the check. Their first attempt at the check, I'll note. And so I told them there was a little bit of a reference to maybe something like immortality, some sort of idea about what's going on with the etchings there. And they shared that information with the group and said, I think these eyes are maybe watching over the crypt. I think they might have something to do with maybe keeping these. I think the theory they had in their head was like, there's something about maybe they're immortal and they're keeping them in these crypts. So I was like, oh, that's a fun interpretation of that. But anyways, then it was the fighter's turn. And the rogue had picked the lock to the next door and was kind of like, should we go on? What should we do? The bard was looking into the eye statues, and the fighter was like, I think I'm going to open one of these. Of course, that's like what I wanted to happen, right? As a DM, you want your players to like, well, I'm just going to go for it. And the rest of the group was like, sure, like, yeah, maybe there's some cool treasure in there. Let's see what happens. So the fighter moves the lid and immediately triggers the trap that they had gotten so close to figuring out. The bard, if they'd passed that religion check, would have gotten all of the secrets of like how these eyes are watching over these martyred skeletons' remains to ensure that their sarcophagi are not looted by tomb raiders or adventurers or things like that. And that if the sarcophagus lids are removed without performing a prayer, like reciting the prayer on these eye idols, then exactly what's about to happen that I'll explain happens, right? So they move the lid and the eyes boom, light up and fill the room with this unholy light. And at the same time, all 6 of the sarcophagus lids, boo, 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 the eyes on them open, the lids levitate up into the air, the light kind of spills into the sarcophagi, and 6 skeletons are animated and rise up out of the sarcophagi to fight a group of 3 heroes. That is a deadly fight. That is a tough one, especially for a group that doesn't have a designated healer. 6 skeletons against 3 characters is just, the action economy is not in their favor. And it swung that way very quickly. Despite the character's best efforts of like 2 or maybe even 3 rounds of just like doing exactly what you would expect characters to do. Just like, I'm going to attack. I'm going to try and take one of these skeletons down, right? They attempted that. And they managed to bring a few down. But then what happens? Of course, the eye idols have this light that's filling the room that was responsible for animating the skeletons. So on the skeleton's turn, they were able to attempt a DC 16 con save. And if they passed, this light from these eyes would bring them back up with 1 HP. Thankfully, that only happened once. The party managed to bring down 2 of the skeletons. One of them failed the save and wasn't able to animate. The other one got back up, and that's when all the characters and the players were like, oh boy, like this is really not looking good for us. And in kind of the next round, the rogue, this halfling rogue, had 2 skeletons just clubbing them to death with these metal mauls. The bard in the corner, who had managed to bring up both of the characters, I think both of them, but at least the fighter with a healing word, was pinned against the wall by a skeleton spear and dropped down. So 2 of them went down. The fighter had managed to get back up from healing word, but was really low on HP and was basically having to not 1v1, but 1v like 5 these remaining skeletons. This is when I put on my GM cap and I extended a meta hand of mercy. And I basically just said to them, going into their turn, I kind of recapped what was happening. I set the stage of watching their fellow characters fall and being on the brink of death by these skeletons and seeing these eye statues just filling the light with room, and the rings that were kind of orbiting them with those prayers etched into them. I'd been describing throughout the combat. I will say in my defense, I had been continuously referencing them and saying like the rings are spinning faster and faster and this light is spilling out and the light is coming out of the eyes on the tops of these sarcophagi, and like really trying to get them to kind of go in that direction. But in this moment, seeing like if I don't do something here to like clarify something or help kind of toss a bone, like we're gonna have a TPK session 1, and that's not what I wanted. I didn't want everybody to die, but I had intended for this to be a pretty tough first encounter. So I said, this fighter had the arcane initiate feat, and so I said like through the information that you guys had learned through the bard, kind of studying these prayers and your understanding of magic, even at a basic level, it is reasonable to assume you could guess that these eyes have something to do with these skeletons being animated. And I kind of just left it at that. I was like, but it's totally up to you of what you want to do, but you get a sense that they are somehow connected. And this gave me a little like reassurance, like, oh, that was the right thing to do, because the fighter character was like, I knew it. Like I thought that. I thought there was something connected. So I'm going to do something about that. They'd said like they were leaning towards that, but then had maybe decided to try something else. But when I said this, they're like, okay, great. I know what I'm going to do. So they sacred flame. They use a cantrip on one of these eye idols and call down actually just a fun little bit of description about their character. They're called the God's Hand. Their parents, their father was an undertaker. Their mother was a priest of some kind. And the mother was like the left hand of God, the father the right hand of God. And so their parents have gone missing and they've kind of taken on the identity of both parents. And so they described like with their left hand, or no, they're with their right hand, they like bring up this black fire, this necrotic fire at the base of this statue. And then with their left hand, they bring it back down with white flame and like changed color. And I told them, I was like, this is awesome, but it's not going to be an auto success. What you're going to need to do here to have success, to destroy this idol, is you need to roll at least a 4 or higher on the damage die, because Sacred Flame does a D8. So it's slightly better than a 50-50 chance, but still not a guarantee. And I just pulled that out of my ass right in the moment. Like it wasn't in my notes of like, to destroy an eye idol, you need to do exactly 4 damage. No, I would never prep something that specific. But in the moment, with how dramatic everything was going, I knew it needed to come down to a dice roll, but I didn't want to worry about armor class. Granted, Sacred Flame is a save, but I wasn't going to have a statue make a save. And I knew there needed to be some damage dealt, but I didn't want it to be like, you need a 6 or a 7 or higher. Like that just felt too unlikely for this moment. So I went with 4, just almost right in the middle. And of course, they roll a 4. They get that 4, exactly what they needed. So I described the fire with their right hand. As they bring it up, it kind of superheats the metal. And then as they bring their left hand down, the fire kind of crumples everything in as the metal liquefies. And as that eye idol is destroyed, boom, half of the sarcophagus lids, the eyes all close. They fall down. Those skeletons immediately deanimate. They were the ones kind of up by the bard, about to spear them through. That gets the attention of the other skeletons that had been about to kill the rogue. So now it's just the fighter versus, I think there were only 2 skeletons left at this point. So still, a TPK is within the realm of possibility here. They had to survive 1 more round of the skeleton attacks. Thankfully, they did. I think they got reduced down to like 1 or 2 HP. So it was super close, which just added to the dramatics of this whole thing. But then the fighter with their little bit of HP, knowing that they're not going to fight these skeletons, they can't run through them. They don't want to provoke opportunity attacks to get to the eye statue. They bonus action equip their longbow and take this shot. It comes down to one shot. The reason they did the longbow instead of just Sacred Flaming again is because even though Sacred Flame would have been an auto hit with an auto failed save, the damage die would have been they still would have rolled a 1d8, needed a 4 or higher, but there was no modifier to that. But with their longbow, it would be, what does a longbow do? Is it still a 1d8? I don't know off the top of my head, but they would have gotten their damage modifier to that. So their odds of doing enough damage to destroy it would have been way higher. And they had a Bardic Inspiration die still on them from the Bard who was bleeding out in the corner. So it was just like, oh, it was so poetic. It was so perfect. Exactly the kind of cool way you want a combat to go in a lot of ways, where coming down to this one roll, they fail the check. They get to add their Bardic Inspiration. That pushes it over, and they send this arrow whizzing between these two skeletons that are rushing towards them with their metal clubs. It hits the eye statue right in the middle. I describe it kind of shattering through the arcane lens and breaking apart on the inside, and all of the rings start spinning and kind of breaking on themselves, and the thing shatters. And as the skeletons run to make the swing, they deanimate, fall to the ground. The last of the lids, poof, 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 hit down, and TPK avoided. It was so awesome. It was so cool. Even though like the players were clearly like had been saying, and even as the session was ending, like, oh my God, like I can't believe we almost died in the first session. That was crazy. And like they seemed pretty like exhausted from the fight, both like as a player and a character. They all were just like so hyped about how it had gone and the way they managed to get out of it, and to kind of transition out of that story and into like the lesson here. And I'll make it kind of quick here at the end. I did not take this as like a failure on my end or a failure on the players' end. I didn't get frustrated in my head of like, oh, I can't. Why did I have this be such a deadly encounter? Oh, why was I thinking there were only 3 characters instead of 4? If I had thought about it. No, I didn't judge myself for that, because that's just could be the way that a D&D world goes sometimes, right? You go into a crypt and the skeletons are all animated. Hey, if there's only 3 of you, like this crypt wasn't going to be built to, the people who built this crypt don't think about or care about how many people are going to come loot it. It just happened to be that in the size of the room, there was enough space for me to put 6 of these sarcophagi, and that's just how it went. So I didn't judge myself for that, and I also didn't get frustrated with my players of like, these idiots, like, what are you doing? Like, how many times do I have to describe these spinning eye statues before you do something? Like, no, they're new players, and also, as I've been playing in a couple games myself, I am reminded all the time of how easy it is to just get lost or hyper-focused on the next action, the spell slots you have left, your character's actions on the character sheet. Like, it's so easy to just put these blinders on and forget kind of what's going on around you, that this extended hand, this GM tip of just like, hey, don't forget about this. And also a little added bit of meta knowledge of like, you can assume that this has something to do with the skeletons being animated. Like, I also don't think that meta was bad or like evil meta, anything that depreciated from the game. I think it added to it. If I hadn't given them that very fair to assume they would have known bit of meta information, then it would have been a TPK. The player probably would have just tried to hit a skeleton, not killed it, or managed to bring it down, but then it might have just gone back up the next turn, and then they would have been killed. And then what? This brand new campaign that I started with 3 players, which this is a campaign through Start Playing, so they're paying to be there, would have ended in a TPK in the first session. Like, what? No, that's not fun for anybody. And especially, it wouldn't have been a TPK that felt fair or satisfying in any sort of way. Like, it just would have been shitty. And so I, looking back on this, think like, actually, like, I pat myself on the back a little bit. Like, good job as a GM. Like, that was a moment where breaking the immersion and being willing to engage in some meta conversation brought the game back out of its death spiral that had it, like, and it wasn't an intentional one, right? It was just like, oh boy, like, I don't think they're kind of realizing what I'm trying to communicate. And that's another great kind of lesson here of like, sometimes you as the GM who are doing all of this prep and know exactly how your things work might think you're communicating it really well to your players, but you might not, like, they just might not be receiving it as well as you want them to. So just putting it very clearly out there, was great. And I also am glad that it happened a little later into the combat. If right at the beginning, I was like, oh yeah, it would be fair to assume you guys can kind of just tell that these are what's animating the skeletons, and there you go. Like, that would have been a pretty lame fight. Now, if they had figured that out through their religion check, and then, like, as the players or as the characters solved the combat before it even began, that's different. But if I had just given them that hint too early, it would have been lame. So, yeah, that's the story of how I almost TPK'd a group of 3 fairly new players in their first session of a paid campaign. Thankfully, that didn't happen. Thankfully, they were awesome. The dice leaned in their favor, and it was on D&D Beyond rolls, so it wasn't getting fudged. It was just all epicness, and I have no regrets. I think it was great, and I hope that you all can kind of take something out of that lesson for yourselves, for your own games, especially if you're a new GM and you're going into a game and you're worried about, like, oh, I don't want to kill everybody. Like, there's ways to not inject the hand of God and completely change the outcome to what you want it to be to spare your party with the Deus Ex Machina thing, right? But there are ways to nudge things in your players' favor, to give them that little bit of knowledge at just the right time, or as close to the right time as you can, to give them a sense of direction. Because it was very clear in this combat that they were just kind of a little lost and just like, I'm just going to keep fighting. That seems to be the only thing I can do. And I was able to tell them in this moment, kind of teach them, hey, not every D&D fight can be solved by just killing the enemy. Sometimes there's a very easy answer that might be right in front of you that you just have to seek out with a skill check or do something that isn't damage dealing. And that might not always be the most fun thing to do. But I think if any of you veteran players are here watching, I think we all know that that stuff actually starts to become the most fun thing. Because after your 1000th attack with a melee weapon, it's like they all are kind of the same. So it's not very fun. So getting them to start already be thinking in the mindset from session 1 of like, we should be looking for other ways to solve problems is great. It was great. So thank you all for watching. Let me know what you think of this down in the comments. Don't forget to leave your hobby tithing like. Check out the Doom Stronghold. Go pick up a copy of Monster Psalms on the church's website. There's so many different ways to support the church right now. Join the Patreon. I could go on and on with the list, but I think y'all get the point here. So love y'all. Mwah. Thanks for watching, and we say these things in their unholy names. Amen.